44. Short, sweet, but a good one. It's hard to beat. Mark turned the ignition off and jumped out of the Jeep. He didn't even think to grab his rifle or pull his pistol. He ran to the door and looked at the bodies. They had swollen up to almost twice their normal size. The stench was unbearable, and he pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket and covered his nose with it. The three faces, though badly misshapen by bullet holes and the swelling, belonged to no one he knew. The two men and a woman had tattoos all over their arms and some on their necks and legs. They all appeared to have been in their late teens or early 20s. He looked up and saw Ed standing 15 or 20 feet from the door, staring at the bodies like he couldn't figure out what they were. Past the staring young man, the three trucks had stopped behind the Jeep. Mark could see the Trans Am coming up the street at a rapid pace. Ted steered the muscle car around the trucks and brought it to a halt beside the Jeep. Gunny exited the Pontiac with surprising agility and started barking orders to the four drivers. He told them to space out around the vehicles and to guard them. He had the riders follow him up to the house with their long arms. When he got to the door and saw Mark without his rifle, he promptly reprimanded him. Rob looked at the bodies and told the group that they'd been gang members and from the looks of them had been dead about 3 days. Gunny had Rob, Joe, and Dwight circle the house and make sure there were no surprises in the backyard. When they came back with nothing out of the ordinary to report, he had Joe and Dwight return to the backyard and guard the back door. With all the entrances to the house covered, he told the others to follow him into the house. "You don't expect me to go in there?" Ed shuddered as he asked, never taking his eyes off the dead bodies. Gunny looked at the young man with disdain. "What's the matter? You never seen maggot chow before?" The young man's eyes grew to the size of silver dollars. He then bent over and hurled his lunch onto the small front lawn. Mark thought he saw the faintest hint of a smile in the old man's eyes. Why don't you help guard the trucks when you're finished puking?" Gunny said. The old man assigned Rob to help Mark clear the house while he watched their backs. Rob nodded his head at Gunny, then looked at Mark for an indication of where to start. Mark tilted his head toward the kitchen. The three men cleared the downstairs room by room. The rooms were full of empty liquor bottles, beer cans, and drug paraphernalia. They found another dead body in the garage. It was as lifeless as the almost brand-new SUV next to it. The young men had the same type of tattoos on the other bodies and appeared to have been dead for about the same amount of time. Rob pointed out that the dead man had his throat cut. Mark was amazed how the blood covered practically the whole garage floor. They went back into the house where Mark and Rob headed upstairs, while Gunny stood at the bottom of the stairs where he could make sure that no one could sneak up behind them. When Mark pushed open the first bedroom door, he wasn't prepared for what he saw. He had become somewhat callous to the sight of dead bodies since his firefight with the MZBs who had attacked the preacher. However, the sights in this room would have haunted even the most battle-hardened man. There were 4 more young gang members who had been bound and obviously tortured to death in the most horrible and unspeakable ways. The other 2 bedrooms had more bodies in them in the same condition. Mark began to visibly shake. He couldn't imagine what kind of person could do these things to another human being. He noticed that it was getting hard to see clearly and realized it was because his eyes were full of tears. Whatever these young gang members may have perpetrated during their lives could never justify the suffering they must have endured during their last hours. When the upstairs was declared clear, Mark came back down, relieved he hadn't found any of his relatives in the house. Rob explained to Gunny what they'd found and reported that some of the bodies upstairs had been dead for only about a day. "It looks like some of them lasted a couple days. I've never seen anything like that," Rob explained. "I've heard about stuff like this a couple of times but never seen it. I don't know if I'll ever be able to get that picture out of my mind." "Who do you think done it?" Gunny asked Rob. "These kids were just wannabe badasses. I'd say they ran into a group of real hardened sickos." "MZBs," Mark interjected sadly. "MZBs?" Rob asked. "Yeah, mutant zombie bikers." "That fits. Anyway, I don't know if the gang was living here and the MZBs ambushed them, or if they were looting houses and pissed off the MZBs somehow. I think that's the most likely scenario. The MZBs probably chased them down the street and cornered them in here. There were a couple of bodies further up the street. They could have been the kids' lookouts, or they got capped first. Whatever happened, I'd say that they made some tactically unsound decisions." "No shit," Gunny said. "They're probably at my dad's house," Mark said to no one in particular. My sister and her family. Let's get out of here. There's nothing in here worth taking, and I'm with Rob. I'm going to have nightmares about this shit for the rest of my life. Mark headed out the front door. Gunny and Rob came out a minute later. Gunny gave the men the PG-rated version of what had happened and instructed them to be very watchful as they drove to Mark's parents' house. The men loaded up and headed out. When they were back on the ranch road, Ed looked over at Mark and asked a question. Was it that bad upstairs? I don't think you really want to know. Why do you ask? You didn't blink twice when you looked at the dead people downstairs. In fact, you looked almost happy. But when you came back outside, you looked like you were scared. I wasn't happy those people were dead, if that's what you mean. I was happy it wasn't my family, that's all. And I am scared. I didn't know it was possible for people to turn into such animals. Now, if you don't mind, I don't want to talk about it anymore. Okay, the younger man said as he looked nervously from one side of the road to the other. Mark noticed that he gripped the AR as though someone might snatch it away from him. Maybe what he saw will change his way of thinking, Mark thought. It was less than 15 miles from his sister's house on the south side of Waco to where his father and brother's houses shared a 2-acre tract on the northern outskirts of town. But it felt like it was 300 miles to Mark. Victor had to call him 3 times on the radio to tell him to slow down a little. It was almost sunset, and Mark felt an overpowering desire to get there before dark. At least it had stopped raining for the moment. Mark was a little concerned when the gate was open. As he turned down the driveway and cleared the huge ancient oaks that obscured the house from the road, Mark felt as if his world had shattered. Both houses were burned to the ground. Faint curls of smoke rose lazily to the sky from a few lingering hot spots. They took with them the last wisps of hope Mark had of ever seeing his family again. Mark shut off the Jeep and sat staring at the ruins. The only thing standing was his dad's metal storage building that sat toward the back of the property. It had gang graffiti across the front of it. Mark couldn't imagine that his dad and brother had succumbed to ordinary gangbangers. It would have taken some bad MZBs to take them, especially if Monica and Jeff were here. Mike had quite a collection of guns, and most of them military-type rifles, and he knew how to use them. He'd attended several courses at a school in Tennessee called Tactical Response. Mark wished he'd taken Mike up on his invitation to go with him a time or two. He realized now that being able to shoot a gun and knowing how to fight with one were 2 different things, something Mike had told him on many occasions. Someone tapped on the plastic window of the Jeep. Mark looked and saw Gunny standing there. Mark opened the door and stepped out. I can't believe they're all dead, Gunny. You don't know that. Maybe they're in a shelter in town, Gunny suggested. Not likely. Mike was always harping on how government had shredded the Constitution and grown into a monster. He wouldn't have gone to anything like a government shelter. Maybe your dad talked him into going. My old man was so conservative, he'd have made us look like a couple of socialists. I never once heard him say the word government without a few choice adjectives before it, and at least when my mother wasn't listening, he wouldn't have gone either. Then they could have bugged out. That's possible, I guessed, Mark thought. He was starting to sound like Ed with the guessing. Mike had prepared this place for the Y2K bug that never happened. Dad bought into it some and helped out all he could. Mike tried to get me to stock up on a bunch of stuff, but I did enough to get him off my back. I kind of got a kick out of him being so wrong. Anyway, they had everything they needed to stay here. Truth be told, I expected to get here and find them in better shape than we're in. I don't see them walking away from all of their preparations without a fight. Most of the men were standing around listening to Mark and Gunny's conversation. 2 of them were standing guard behind the vehicles. I better go see if they're in there, Mark added, nodding at the remains of one of the houses.